In a quaint European kingdom, nestled between rolling hills and ancient forests, there existed an institution that was as old as the monarchy itself, the Royal Cavalry Guard. This elite group of soldiers wasn't just any ordinary unit. They were the living embodiment of tradition, discipline, and honor. For centuries, their primary duty had been to protect the royal family, but their role extended far beyond mere security. They were also the caretakers of some of the most magnificent horses the world had ever seen. These animals weren't just beasts of burden or tools for transport. They were symbols of power, elegance, and loyalty. The bond between the guards and their horses was legendary. Each soldier was paired with a horse from the moment they joined the ranks, and together they trained tirelessly until they moved as one. It wasn't uncommon for people to say that you could tell everything about a guard by observing how their horse behaved. If the horse was calm and obedient, it meant the rider was skilled and trustworthy. But if the horse seemed restless or uneasy, it spoke volumes about the rider's abilities or lack thereof. Among these esteemed guards was Captain Adrian Falk, a man whose reputation preceded him wherever he went. Tall, broad-shouldered, and with piercing blue eyes, Falk commanded respect not only because of his rank, but also because of his unwavering dedication to his duties. He had served in the cavalry for over 15 years, and during that time, he had earned the nickname the Horse Whisperer among his peers. His ability to connect with even the wildest stallions was nothing short of extraordinary. But what truly set Falk apart was his relationship with his own horse, Ares. Named after the Greek god of war, Ares was no ordinary animal. With a coat as black as midnight and muscles that rippled beneath his sleek hide, he looked every bit the warrior his name suggested. Ares carried himself with an air of quiet confidence, as though he knew he was special. And perhaps he did. After all, he had been bred specifically for the royal cavalry, descended from a long line of champion steeds. Falk and Ares shared a bond so deep that it almost seemed telepathic. Whether they were parading through the streets during festivals or standing guard outside the palace gates, the two moved in perfect harmony. To outsiders, it might have appeared as though Ares understood every word Falk said, and maybe he did. The captain often joked that Ares was smarter than half the recruits who joined the cavalry. But despite his sharp wit, Falk never allowed anyone to take liberties with his prized companion. Touching Ares without permission was strictly forbidden, a rule known to everyone in the kingdom. Locals whispered stories of tourists who had tried to sneak a pat on Ares' gleaming neck, only to be met with Falk's icy glare. Some claimed that Ares himself didn't tolerate such behavior. He would pin his ears back and bare his teeth, warning intruders to keep their distance. While these tales may have been exaggerated, one thing was certain: messing with Ares was like challenging the entire Royal Cavalry Guard. And yet, despite the clear warnings, there were always those who thought the rules didn't apply to them. Little did anyone know, a visitor was about to arrive in the kingdom, a cheerful but somewhat reckless traveler who had no idea just how seriously the guards took their traditions. Her arrival would set off a chain of events that would test the patience of even the stoic Captain Falk and leave the townsfolk talking for weeks to come. Maggie Thompson was not your typical tourist. She wasn't the kind of person who stuck to carefully planned itineraries or spent hours researching cultural norms before visiting a new place. Instead, Maggie prided herself on being spontaneous, adventurous, and unapologetically curious about the world. Her Instagram feed was a kaleidoscope of colorful photos: sunsets over tropical beaches, bustling markets in Asia, ancient ruins in South America, all accompanied by captions that read like motivational quotes. To Maggie, travel was more than just sightseeing. It was about collecting experiences, meeting people, and capturing moments she could look back on with pride. When Maggie arrived in the small European kingdom, she was immediately captivated by its charm. The cobblestone streets were lined with quaint shops selling handmade crafts, while towering castles loomed majestically against the horizon. It felt like stepping into a fairy tale. But what caught her attention most was the Royal Cavalry Guard. clad in their ornate uniforms, shimmering helmets, polished boots, and intricately designed jackets, they cut striking figures as they rode through the town's main square. Their horses, equally stunning, moved with a grace that made them seem almost otherworldly. The guards weren't hard to spot. They were everywhere during the Festival of Kings, an annual celebration honoring the country's rich history and royal lineage. Parades featuring the cavalry drew huge crowds, with visitors jostling for the best views. Children pointed excitedly at the riders, while adults snapped photos and whispered admiring comments about the horses. Maggie couldn't resist joining in. Armed with her trusty camera, she wove through the throngs of people, determined to capture the perfect shot. What Maggie didn't realize, however, was that her enthusiasm often bordered on recklessness. She had a habit of getting too close to her subjects, ignoring boundaries in pursuit of the ideal photo. Back home, this hadn't caused many problems. After all, statues didn't mind if you climbed onto their pedestals, and street performers usually appreciated the extra attention. But here, things were different. This wasn't just another picturesque location. It was a place where traditions ran deep, and respect for authority was non-negotiable. Despite her good intentions, Maggie failed to pick up on the subtle cues around her. Locals gave polite smiles, but kept their distance from the guards and their horses. Tour guides reminded their groups to stay behind designated barriers during parades. Even the horses themselves seemed to exude an aura of dignity, standing tall and unmoving as cameras clicked away nearby. Yet none of this registered with Maggie. All she saw were opportunities for great pictures. And nothing, not even a stern glare from one of the guards, was going to stop her. On her first day in town, Maggie managed to get several impressive shots of the cavalry. She captured close-ups of the guards' gleaming helmets, candid images of them interacting with locals, and wide-angle shots of the horses trotting in formation. But something, or rather, someone, kept drawing her eye. A massive black stallion named Aries. His glossy coat caught the sunlight perfectly, and his powerful strides commanded attention. Maggie found herself returning to the parade road multiple times, hoping to get a better angle of him. Each time, though, there was always a barrier, a rope, a line of spectators, or one of the guards themselves, keeping her at bay. By the end of the day, frustration began to creep in. Why did everyone seem so protective of these animals? Weren't they used to being admired? Surely no harm would come from getting just a little closer. Unaware of the significance of Aries and his fellow steeds, Maggie decided she'd try again tomorrow. After all, she reasoned, rules were meant to be bent sometimes. What she didn't know was that bending those particular rules might lead to consequences far greater than she could imagine. The next morning, Maggie woke up early, determined to make the most of her second day in the kingdom. She had heard from a local cafe owner that the Royal Cavalry Guard often left their horses tied up outside the stables while they prepared for daily drills or attended briefings inside. It was the perfect opportunity, she thought, to get an up-close shot of Aries without the chaos of a crowded parade. Armed with her camera and a newfound sense of determination, Maggie made her way to the stables, humming a cheerful tune as she went. When she arrived, the scene was even better than she'd hoped. A handful of horses stood tethered to posts near the entrance, their glossy coats gleaming in the soft morning light. Soldiers milled about, some adjusting saddles, others chatting quietly among themselves. And there, standing tall and proud at the far end of the row, was Aries. The black stallion looked every bit as majestic as he had during the parade, his muscular frame relaxed but alert. His ears twitched slightly as he surveyed his surroundings, and his dark eyes seemed to hold a wisdom far beyond that of an ordinary animal. Maggie's heart raced with excitement. This was her chance. No barriers, no crowds, just her and the horse she'd been admiring from afar. Without giving it much thought, she approached him slowly, raising her camera to snap a few photos. But something about the moment felt incomplete. A picture isn't enough, she muttered under her breath. I need to capture his spirit. With that thought driving her, she reached out impulsively to touch his mane. imagining how silky it must feel between her fingers. Before she could make contact, however, a deep voice cut through the air like a blade. "Stop right there." Maggie froze, her hand hovering inches away from Era's neck. Turning her head, she saw Captain Adrian Falk striding toward her, his expression unreadable but undeniably stern. He moved with purpose, each step deliberate, until he was standing directly between her and the horse. "What do you think you're doing?" Falk asked, his tone sharp enough to slice through steel. Maggie blinked, startled by the intensity of his reaction. "I just wanted to pet him," she stammered, suddenly aware of how foolish she sounded. "He's so beautiful." Falk didn't soften. If anything, his glare grew colder. "You don't touch a royal horse without permission," he said firmly, enunciating each word as though speaking to someone who might not understand the gravity of their actions. "These animals are not here for your amusement." For a moment, Maggie was too stunned to respond. She hadn't expected such a fierce reaction. Back home, people loved interacting with animals. It was part of the charm of traveling. Surely this man couldn't be serious. Trying to lighten the mood, she forced a laugh and said, "Relax, I'm not going to hurt him. I just wanted a closer look." Her attempt at humor only made things worse. Falk's jaw tightened, and his piercing blue eyes bore into hers with an intensity that made her wish she could disappear. "This isn't a joke," he replied, his voice low and dangerous. "Ares is more than just a horse. He represents centuries of tradition and service to the crown. Touching him without consent is disrespectful, not just to me, but to the entire kingdom." By now, several other guards had noticed the commotion and were watching silently from a distance. Some exchanged knowing glances, while others shook their heads in disapproval. Maggie felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. She hadn't meant to cause trouble. She was simply trying to appreciate the beauty of the animal. But Falk's words hit harder than she cared to admit. For the first time since arriving in the kingdom, she began to realize that she might have crossed a line. Still, pride got the better of her. Rather than apologizing sincerely, she shrugged and took a step back, muttering, "Fine, whatever. No big deal." Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and walked away, clutching her camera tightly to her chest. As she disappeared down the street, Falk watched her go, his expression unreadable. He knew that tourists like Maggie often came with good intentions, but little understanding of local customs. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that this wouldn't be the last he'd see of her. And when they met again, he intended to make sure she understood the weight of what she'd done. Captain Adrian Falk watched Maggie walk away, her confident stride masking the embarrassment she must have felt. Though she had tried to play it cool, he could tell her bravado was a thin veil over discomfort. Still, her dismissive attitude gnawed at him. It wasn't just about Ares. It was about respect. Respect for tradition, for duty, and for the bond between horse and rider that defined the Royal Cavalry Guard. To Falk, what Maggie had done wasn't merely a careless act. It was a breach of something sacred. Falk turned back to Ares, running a reassuring hand along the stallion's neck. The horse responded by nudging his shoulder gently, as if seeking comfort after the brief encounter. "You handled that better than I did," Falk murmured with a small smile, his voice softening now that the tension had eased. Ares snorted softly, his ears swiveling forward in acknowledgement. Falk knew the horse understood more than most people gave him credit for. After all, years of training and partnership had forged a connection deeper than words could describe. As Falk stood there, calming Ares, his fellow guards began to gather around. They had witnessed the exchange from a distance and were eager to hear his take on the incident. One of them, a younger recruit named Lars, couldn't help but chuckle. "That tourist sure picked the wrong horse to mess with," he said, shaking his head. "And the wrong captain." Falk shot Lars a look that silenced him instantly, though a hint of amusement flickered in his eyes. "It's not funny," he said firmly. "This isn't about me or Ares. It's about what we represent. If we let behavior like that slide, it undermines everything we stand for." The other guards nodded in agreement. To them, the cavalry wasn't just a job, it was a calling. Each member took immense pride in their role as protectors of the royal family and custodians of centuries-old traditions. Their horses weren't pets or props. They were partners, symbols of loyalty and strength. Disrespecting one was akin to insulting the entire unit, and by extension, the kingdom itself. Despite his stern demeanor, Falk couldn't deny that Maggie's audacity intrigued him. Most tourists who accidentally crossed boundaries tended to apologize profusely or slink away in shame. But Maggie, she had walked off as though nothing significant had happened, brushing aside his warning like it was no big deal. There was something bold about her, a mix of carelessness and confidence that set her apart from the usual visitors. "She'll be back," another guard, Victor, chimed in. "They always are. Tourists can't resist our horses or our parades." His tone was teasing, but there was truth in his words. The allure of the Royal Cavalry Guard was undeniable, drawing crowds year-round. And Maggie, with her insatiable curiosity and camera always at the ready, seemed exactly the type to linger longer than most. Falk sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose thoughtfully. He didn't relish the idea of confronting her again, but he also knew that ignoring the situation wouldn't solve anything. If anything, it might encourage further disrespect, not just from Maggie, but from others who saw how easily rules could be bent. No, this needed to be addressed properly. But how? An idea began to form in his mind. Instead of escalating the matter, perhaps he could turn it into an opportunity. Maybe Maggie's ignorance stemmed not from malice, but from a genuine lack of understanding. If that was the case, then maybe education, not punishment, was the key. Teaching her about the significance of the horses and the traditions surrounding them could leave a lasting impression, one that might even inspire her to share what she learned with others. With renewed resolve, Falk straightened up and addressed his men. "Keep an eye out for her," he instructed. "If she comes near the stables again, let me know immediately." His tone left no room for argument. The guards exchanged glances, sensing that their captain had something planned. Whatever it was, they trusted him to handle it with the same precision and fairness he brought to every task. For now, Falk returned to his duties, tending to Aries and ensuring the rest of the horses were prepared for the day's activities. But his thoughts kept drifting back to Maggie. Something about her stuck with him, not because of her actions, but because of the potential she represented. With the right approach, this awkward encounter could become something meaningful. And if there was one thing Captain Adrian Falk excelled at, it was turning challenges into opportunities. News of Maggie's encounter with Captain Falk spread quickly through the ranks of the Royal Cavalry Guard. By mid-morning, it seemed like everyone, from the seasoned veterans to the newest recruits, had heard about the silly tourist who had dared to touch Aries. The story was recounted with varying degrees of exaggeration. Some claimed Maggie had lunged at the horse dramatically, while others joked that Aries himself had almost bitten her hand off. Laughter echoed through the stables as the guards swapped tales, their amusement tinged with a shared sense of pride in their captain's swift response. But beneath the light-hearted chatter, there was also a deeper understanding among the men. They knew this wasn't just about one reckless tourist. It was about preserving the integrity of their unit. The Royal Cavalry Guard wasn't merely a ceremonial spectacle. It was a symbol of the kingdom's history, discipline, and unity. Every action they took, no matter how small, reflected on the crown itself. Allowing someone to disregard their traditions could set a dangerous precedent, especially in an era when outsiders often misunderstood or dismissed cultural practices. As the day wore on, Falk found himself reflecting on the incident more than he cared to admit. He couldn't shake the image of Maggie walking away, her dismissive shrug lingering in his mind. Part of him wanted to let it go. After all, she was just a visitor passing through, unlikely to cause any real harm. But another part of him felt uneasy. If tourists like Maggie left the kingdom without learning the significance of its customs, what message did that send? Would they return home thinking these traditions were trivial or outdated? That evening, after the horses had been fed and settled for the night, Falk joined a few of his fellow guards in the barracks. The room buzzed with conversation as they relaxed over mugs of hot tea and plates of hearty stew. When the topic inevitably turned back to Maggie, Falk listened quietly, letting his comrades vent their frustrations and share their jokes. Finally, Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "So, what are you going to do about her?" he asked, raising an eyebrow at Falk. Falk hesitated, swirling the remnants of his tea thoughtfully. "I've been thinking," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe punishing her isn't the best approach. She didn't mean any harm. She just didn't know better. What if we showed her instead of telling her?" The room fell silent as the other guards exchanged puzzled glances. "Showed her?" Lars repeated, clearly skeptical. "What does that even mean?" "It means inviting her to see what we do up close," Falk explained. "Let her spend time with the horses, learn about their training, understand why they're so important to us. If she leaves with a real appreciation for our traditions, then maybe this whole situation can turn into something positive." Victor scratched his chin thoughtfully. "You think she'll actually come? After the way you chewed her out earlier?" Falk smirked slightly. "People like her thrive on experiences. If we frame it as a special opportunity, a private tour of the stables, I doubt she'll say no. Besides, curiosity got her into this mess in the first place. Why not use it to teach her something?" The idea seemed to resonate with the group. While some were still hesitant, others nodded in agreement, impressed by Falk's willingness to take a different approach. It wasn't often that the captain suggested turning a potential conflict into a teaching moment, but when he did, his ideas usually worked. The next morning, Falk put his plan into motion. Using contacts within the local tourism office, he arranged for an invitation to be sent to Maggie's hotel. Written in polite, formal language, the note extended her an exclusive behind-the-scenes tour of the royal stables, complete with a chance to meet the legendary horses and their riders. To sweeten the deal, it mentioned that Captain Falk himself would be hosting the visit, a detail he hoped would pique her interest. When Maggie received the invitation later that afternoon, she was both surprised and intrigued. At first, she wondered if it was some kind of trick, a way for Falk to embarrass her further. But as she read the elegant script and imagined the photos she could capture during such a unique experience, her excitement outweighed her doubts. Flattered by the gesture and eager to redeem herself, and maybe prove a point, she accepted the offer without hesitation. Unbeknownst to Maggie, however, this wasn't just a casual tour. For Falk and his men, it was a calculated move, a chance to bridge the gap between ignorance and understanding, to show rather than scold. And as Falk prepared for her arrival, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of anticipation. This silly tourist might have started as a nuisance, but she was about to become part of a lesson neither of them would soon forget. The morning of the private tour dawned bright and clear, with sunlight streaming through the stable windows and casting golden patterns on the polished wooden floors. Captain Adrian Falk stood near the entrance, his posture as straight and commanding as ever, though there was a subtle softness in his demeanor today. He had spent the previous evening preparing, not just the stables, but himself. This wasn't going to be a lecture or a reprimand. It was an opportunity to share something deeply meaningful with someone who might not otherwise understand its value. When Maggie arrived, she looked different from the last time Falk had seen her. Gone was the carefree confidence that had led her to touch airs without permission. Instead, she seemed almost nervous, clutching her camera tightly and glancing around as if unsure what to expect. She wore a casual yet respectful outfit, a fitted blouse paired with jeans, and carried a small notebook tucked under one arm. It was clear she intended to take this experience seriously, even if she didn't fully grasp why it mattered so much. "Good morning," Falk greeted her, his voice calm and measured. There was no trace of the sharpness from their earlier encounter. "Thank you for accepting our invitation." Maggie smiled hesitantly, shifting her weight from one foot to the other. "Thanks for having me," she replied. I, I really appreciate the chance to see this side of things. Falk nodded, gesturing for her to follow him inside. As they walked, he began explaining the history of the Royal Cavalry Guard, weaving together stories of battles fought centuries ago and modern-day ceremonies that kept traditions alive. His words painted a vivid picture of loyalty, sacrifice, and pride, drawing Maggie deeper into the world he inhabited. For the first time since arriving in the kingdom, she felt like she was seeing beyond the surface, the parades, the uniforms, the horses, and glimpsing the soul of the institution. They stopped at the first stall, where a sleek chestnut mare named Luna stood patiently munching hay. Falk introduced her warmly, stroking her neck as he spoke about her training and temperament. Luna is known for her speed and agility, he explained. She's often chosen for ceremonial escorts because she moves gracefully under pressure. Maggie listened intently, jotting down notes and snapping photos when prompted. She asked thoughtful questions about the horse's diet, daily routine, and how long it took to train them, which surprised Falk. Perhaps she was more interested than he had initially given her credit for. As they moved from stall to stall, Falk continued sharing insights, each story building on the last. He spoke of the bond between rider and horse, describing it as a partnership built on trust and mutual respect. A horse isn't just a tool or a means to an end, he said firmly. It's a living being with thoughts, feelings, and instincts. We have to earn their cooperation every single day. Maggie nodded, her expression growing increasingly reflective. She had never thought about horses, or animals in general, in such a profound way. Growing up in a city, her interactions with animals had been limited to pets or occasional visits to zoos. The idea that these creatures played such a vital role in preserving tradition was both humbling and inspiring. Finally, they reached Ares' stall. The black stallion stood tall and regal, his presence commanding attention even among the other magnificent horses. Maggie swallowed hard, suddenly aware of the gravity of the moment. Falk noticed her hesitation and stepped closer, speaking gently. Ares is special, he said. He's not only my partner, but also a symbol of everything we stand for. Would you like to meet him? Maggie hesitated, glancing at Falk uncertainly. Are you sure? She asked quietly. After what happened? Falk gave her a reassuring smile, though his eyes remained serious. This is your chance to make amends, he said simply. But remember, respect comes first. With that, he handed her a brush and showed her how to groom Ares gently, emphasizing the importance of slow, deliberate movements. At first, Maggie was tentative, afraid she might do something wrong. But as Ares leaned into her touch, his massive body radiating warmth and strength, she began to relax. For the first time, she truly understood the depth of the connection between horse and human, and why crossing that boundary had been such a grave offense. By the time they finished, Maggie's hands were covered in horsehair, but her face was glowing with newfound appreciation. She turned to Falk, her voice filled with sincerity. Thank you, she said softly. I think I get it now. And for the first time, Falk believed her. As the grooming session with Ares came to an end, Maggie stepped back, brushing stray strands of hair from her face. Her cheeks were flushed, not just from the physical effort of working with the horse, but from the emotions swirling inside her. For the first time since arriving in the kingdom, she felt a pang of genuine remorse for her earlier actions. What had seemed like harmless curiosity now struck her as thoughtless and disrespectful. She glanced at Captain Falk, who stood nearby, watching her with an unreadable expression. I'm sorry, Maggie said suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet hum of the stable. Falk raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sincerity in her tone. I mean it, she continued, clutching the brush tightly in her hands. I didn't realize how much these horses, and you, meant to this place. I was just caught up in the moment. Falk studied her for a long moment before nodding slowly. Apology accepted, he replied, his voice softer than usual. But remember, it's not just about me or Ares. It's about what we represent. The traditions, the history, the bond between rider and horse. These things matter deeply to us. Maggie nodded earnestly, her eyes flickering to Ayres as the stallion let out a soft snort. She couldn't help but smile. Despite everything, there was something undeniably majestic about him. I get it now, she admitted. You're not just protecting a horse. You're protecting a legacy. Falk allowed himself a small smile, one that reached his piercing blue eyes. Exactly, he said. And that's why respect is so important. Without it, traditions fade and connections are lost. The two fell into a comfortable silence as Maggie finished tidying up the grooming supplies. The atmosphere in the stable had shifted subtly. It was no longer tense or awkward, but warm and collaborative. Maggie felt a sense of accomplishment, knowing she had taken a step toward understanding a culture that was vastly different from her own. For Falk, seeing her transformation was rewarding. He hadn't expected her to be so receptive, but her willingness to learn reminded him why he loved his role as a teacher and guardian of tradition. Before wrapping up the tour, Falk decided to share one final story, one he hoped would leave a lasting impression. Leading Maggie to a corner of the stable, he pointed to a framed photograph hanging on the wall. In it, a younger version of Falk stood beside Ayres, both of them adorned with medals during a royal ceremony. That was the day Ayres and I officially became partners, Falk explained. It wasn't easy getting here. Ayres was wild when we first met, stubborn, unpredictable, and full of fire. But over time, we learned to trust each other. Now he's more than my horse. He's family. Maggie stared at the photo, captivated by the raw emotion captured in it. He really is incredible, she murmured. Then, after a pause, she added, and so are you. Falk chuckled lightly, though his gaze remained steady. We all have our roles to play, he said modestly. Mine is to protect and preserve what matters most. Yours, perhaps, is to share what you've learned today with your friends, your followers, anyone who will listen. Maggie nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. As a traveler and storyteller, she realized she had a unique opportunity to bridge gaps between cultures. By sharing her experience in the kingdom, she could help others understand the beauty and significance of traditions they might otherwise overlook. By the time they left the stables, the sun had climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard. Falk walked Maggie to the edge of the property, where her next adventure awaited. Thank you again, she said, turning to face him. This has been unforgettable. It's not every day someone gets to meet Ayres up close, Falk replied with a hint of amusement. Just promise me one thing. If you ever come back, don't try to pet him without asking first. Maggie laughed, the sound light and genuine. Deal, she said, extending her hand. Falk shook it firmly, sealing their newfound mutual respect. As she walked away, camera slung over her shoulder, Maggie couldn't help but glance back once more at the stables, and at Ayres, whose dark silhouette stood proudly in the distance. For Falk, the encounter marked yet another chapter in his life as a guardian of tradition. Though Maggie had started as a nuisance, she had ended as a reminder of the power of patience and understanding. And for Maggie, the experience would stay with her forever. A lesson in humility, respect, and the enduring bonds that connect people, animals, and history. Months passed, and life in the small European kingdom returned to its usual rhythm. The Royal Cavalry Guard continued their duties with the same precision and dedication that had defined them for centuries. Captain Adrian Falk went about his routines, training recruits, caring for Ayres, and leading parades during festivals. Yet, every now and then, he found himself thinking about Maggie Thompson, the spirited tourist who had unknowingly sparked a lesson neither of them would forget. Back in America, Maggie's adventures had taken her to new destinations, but her time in the kingdom lingered vividly in her mind. She often recounted the story of her encounter with Captain Falk and Ayres to friends over coffee or while scrolling through photos on her phone. Her Instagram feed featured a series of posts dedicated to the experience, Close-up shots of Ares' glossy coat, candid images of Falk explaining the horse's training, and even a heartfelt caption about learning respect for traditions beyond her own understanding. Sometimes, she wrote beneath one photo, "The best lessons come when you least expect them." Her followers loved the posts. Many commented asking questions about the Royal Cavalry Guard, intrigued by the blend of history, culture, and human-animal partnership she described. Others shared their own stories of cultural misunderstandings turned into moments of growth. Maggie realized that her experience wasn't just personal. It resonated with people all over the world. It became a reminder that travel wasn't just about seeing beautiful places. It was about connecting with the people and customs that made those places unique. Meanwhile, back in the kingdom, word of Maggie's online posts eventually reached Falk. One of the younger guards showed him the photos and captions during a break, chuckling at how enthusiastically Maggie had documented her visit. At first, Falk raised an eyebrow, unsure what to make of it. But as he scrolled through the posts, he couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Not because Maggie had praised him or the cavalry, but because she had captured the essence of what they stood for. Her words reflected a deeper appreciation for the traditions she had once dismissed, and that meant more to Falk than any medal or accolade ever could. The townsfolk also caught wind of Maggie's posts, thanks to the growing number of tourists who recognized scenes from her pictures. Locals began sharing her story, adding their own anecdotes about the strict yet fair captain and his legendary horse. Some joked that Falk should send Maggie a thank-you note for the free publicity, while others teased him about becoming an international sensation. Falk took it all in stride, though he secretly enjoyed hearing how his actions had left such a lasting impression. As winter approached, the kingdom prepared for its annual Festival of Kings once again. This year, however, there was a noticeable change among visitors. Tourists seemed more respectful around the horses, keeping a polite distance and asking permission before taking photos. Guides credited this shift to increased awareness, much of which stemmed from Maggie's widely shared posts. Even Falk noticed the difference, nodding approvingly as families admired Ares from afar instead of crowding too close. One evening, as Falk stood outside the stables watching Ares graze in the fading light, he reflected on the ripple effect of that single encounter. What had started as a minor confrontation had blossomed into something meaningful, a bridge between cultures, a moment of mutual understanding. He smiled faintly, running a hand along Ares' neck. "You've got quite the fan club now," he murmured to the stallion, who responded with a contented snort. For Maggie, the memory of the kingdom remained a cherished part of her journey. Though she ventured far and wide, collecting stamps in her passport and stories in her heart, none compared to the day she learned humility from a proud captain and his majestic horse. And for Falk, the incident served as a reminder of the power of patience in teaching, an enduring testament to the bond between humans, animals, and tradition. In the end, both Maggie and Falk walked away changed, not dramatically, but subtly, in ways that enriched their lives. Their paths may never cross again, but the impact of their meeting would echo for years to come, carried forward by the stories they told and the lessons they shared. After all, sometimes the smallest moments leave the biggest impressions, and in this case, it was proof that even the silliest tourist could stumble upon wisdom when guided by the right hand.